Okay, thank you, Jose Luis. And I wanted to thank Jose Luis for organizing my trip and giving me the opportunity, inviting me to speak to your group. It's my first trip to Spain, and so my wife is with me and we're really enjoying it. And I want to thank Elsever for sponsoring my trip. And we really love Madrid. We have never been Spain, period, but Madrid we're very fascinated by the buildings and the architecture, and you can get taxi cabs very easily. And it's a very nice city to get around. So we've really enjoyed our stay. We've gone to museums, and we went to the football stadium, the Real Madrid football stadium. So my son is very excited that we did that. He was trying to find us a game to go to, but there's no games while we're in Madrid, and we're going to Bilbao on tomorrow. And there's no games up there either, so we're not doing that. What I want to do today is I want to talk to you, and the title of my talk is, I don't do a lot of Spanish. So there's the title, but there's the English title. And it was very nice that Steve kind of brought you up to date with what's happening in the UK with regards to anatomy education and medical school curricula. And I'm going to do the same thing with regards to teaching in the United States. And not only talk to you about anatomy teaching, but to talk to you about what's happening with the whole curriculum. And in the United States, we've been in a period of curricular reform for probably the last 8 to 10 years, and it's probably going to continue for the next 5 to 10 years. Because things are changing, and everybody wants to change. So I'm going to sort of kind of end up with that, plus then with regards to anatomy teaching, I'm going to give you some examples of how people are changing their curriculums and their courses to kind of fit with the new direction of education, and some innovative type things that our anatomists are doing. So we'll end the talk showing you how other people are doing some things in the United States. But first of all, we're going to do a history lesson. And I thought it would be maybe a good idea to show you how medical education in the United States got to the point it was. And so we're going to go back 100 years, actually about 110 years, to the early 1900s, late 1890s. And this would be pre-Flexner. And some of you may have heard of this name, but you may not know much about kind of why we always refer to him. So I'll give you a little history on that too. So before Flexner, and Flexner's report came out in 1910. So we're now talking turn of the century United States. Medical education in the United States had a lot of medical schools. In fact, there were 155 medical schools. And we are just now back to that number with the 18 new medical schools that are starting in the United States. So we're right around the 155, 160 medical schools in the United States. And so that was a lot of medical schools, and many of them were established for commercial motives. So basically, you paid your money to me, I taught you how to be a doctor, so I made money teaching you to become a doctor. They weren't exactly very good schools necessarily, but they put out doctors. Also, they had very weak and varied admission standards. So some medical schools back in those days, you didn't have to have a high school diploma to get into. You didn't have to have a college degree. Some schools you had to have college degrees, so there was a wide variety of students that were becoming doctors. There was a substantial variability between the schools. There was no curricular uniformity. A lot of the schools just sort of developed a curriculum and they did whatever they wanted to do. So poor curricular development and not a lot of uniformity. The apprenticeship model was followed, and that basically meant that you followed me around for a year and then you became a doctor. That's it. And that was the type of model that was followed. Again, not in all the schools in the United States, because obviously there was Johns Hopkins out there. There were many of the major universities did have good quality programs. But these were a lot of these commercial schools that were available in all over the United States. And finally, there was no common standards of quality, a lack of certification of the doctors, and no residency training. So again, this was a time before we had anything to say what your license had to exist or what you had to accomplish before you could be licensed. So this was kind of a strange time in American medical education. And what happened about this time, the American Medical Association and the American Association of Medical Colleges, which are still around today, visited schools in 1906, and they found that there were a lot of problems. But because they were the ones licensing the doctors, they couldn't say much about it. So they had to find a different way to evaluate the schools. So what they did was they approached a third party, the Carnegie Foundation, and said, can you do a study of our schools and help us figure out what the problems are? And so the Carnegie Foundation, which was an independent operation at that point, hired an individual named Abraham Flexner. So this is where Flexner came in. And he was an educator. He was not a physician. He was a professional educator trained as such. And he was asked to do this study. So who was Adam Flexner? Well, before I did kind of looking into this type of talk, I really didn't know much about him, although I'd heard his name all my career. And it turns out he was an education scholar. He graduated from Johns Hopkins University with his bachelor's degree when he was 19 years old. And that was pretty unique back in those times, as it's still unique in this time. Then he went back to where he was from, which was Kentucky, and he founded schools to test his ideas about education. And what he was interested in his schools was to have small classes, personal attention, and hands-on teaching. Doesn't that sound very familiar? And so he had students in these schools, and all of a sudden his students were getting accepted at the major universities in the United States. And his schools were in Louisville, Kentucky. They were a high school type of education, but his students were getting into the best universities in the United States. So he obviously had an idea, and it was working. He did some graduate studies at Harvard, and then he came over to Europe and he studied in Berlin. And this is where he got some of his later ideas that I'll mention. But he never got an advanced degree. So a lot of times you'll see his name and they'll call him Dr. Flexner or something. He actually has no advanced degree, not a master's degree, nothing other than a bachelor's degree. He never completed any of his graduate studies. He wrote his first book in 1908, and it was called The American College, and it was critical of American higher education. And he regarded lectures as handle cheaply a large body of students, give the lecturer time for research. Again, doesn't that sound familiar? It certainly does in America, because that's kind of typical of what large universities do with regards to research and lecturing now. But this was in 1908. So Flexner's report came out in 1910, and what he did, believe it or not, he visited every medical school in the United States, 155 medical schools. This was before there were cars, there were trains, and horses and buggies. And he went so far in his study that he would go to a medical school, and the dean would take him around and he would show him all these wonderful facilities they would have. But the doors were locked at a lot of these schools. And at least one of the schools, he was suspicious. So they dropped him back off at the railroad station. He hired a buggy, went back to the medical school, found a janitor who opened the doors to all these wonderful labs, and they were completely empty. And again, these were many of these commercial schools that had a nice sign out front, had signs on the doors, but they didn't do anything. So this is what he found, but believe it or not, he visited every medical school in the United States before he wrote his report. And basically, what he did was he found his basic conclusions were that university-based curricular design provides the best approach. And he named kind of Johns Hopkins University. Now, again, University of Pennsylvania was around. There were many other major universities, but he indicated that Johns Hopkins was School of Medicine was kind of the standard. That's what everything should look like. And he indicated schools must have strong educational programs and high quality standards. So this was when medical education in the United States started to change, was 1910. So after his report came out, then these were his specific recommendations. That medical schools should be affiliated with universities. When he did that, or made that recommendation, in the next few years, the number of medical schools started to decrease. He said admission standards should be increased and they should be standardized. Again, when this came out and was put into practice, number of students decreased. So now we're dropping medical schools, we're dropping students. So we're becoming a little more precise in what the production is. He said he discovered and indicated that the sciences are fundamental to medicine, and this should be reflected in the training. That the academic model was much better and should be followed versus the apprenticeship model, and I think everybody would agree with that. And schools should strive for higher quality faculty and better learning environments and facilities. So again, start to have good laboratories, good spaces for the students to work. And finally, a better structured and meaningful clinical training. So this was, again, where some of the ideas started to come in, not only clinical training in the later years of medical school, but also into residency type programs. And so the result of his report were basically these two major points. High standards for admissions, college degree with science requirements. So this was, again, where the change in the United States was put into place. You needed to have a college degree if you were going to come to medical school. And then this is the model that basically, as you all know, is what the United States has followed since 1910. 2 years of basic sciences with laboratory experience, followed by 2 years of clinical experience. And that's pretty much the model we have, is this 2+2 type of model. And actually, we still have it, but that's where the changes are starting to come in now as far as what's going on in these 2+2 years. So, going on. Actually, nothing happened with regards to changing his model till we get into the last quarter of the 20th century. Believe it or not, the United States system basically stayed the same for nearly 70 years before any real changes took place. And in the United States, most of the changes take place when some group does a report. That may be good or bad, but when somebody does a report, the deans all start listening to the report and they start saying that everybody needs to change. And so, as we go along, there were some initial rumblings, and this was basically into the 1980s. Right? And there were more demands on the curriculum increasing. So that this is, again, we've all seen this, where other things are kind of creeping into the curriculum and need to be taught. Explosion of medical knowledge. Other types of activities that the students need to be exposed to. Also, again, explosion of knowledge in biomedical sciences. So whenever this happens, and this has happened currently in our curriculums at all of your institutions, more people want to get into the curriculum. That they think the students need to hear about this topic, so we want time in the curriculum. Change teaching methods. And what happened here was a little bit about what Steve was talking about, is people started to pay attention to how people learn, not just how we teach. And again, this was kind of in the early 1980s when some of this started to come in, and the thought was that we really should look at the learner and not necessarily just focus on the teacher and the presentation of the material. There was more integration between, well, they wanted people to have more integration between the basic sciences and clinical application. And this is getting into kind of bringing the clinical things down to the first 2 years. And a little bit more contextual learning. And again, that's sort of met with good and bad results. And finally, problem-based learning was introduced. And McMaster introduced this in 1969. I'm not sure when Maastricht and some of the groups over here did it, but it was after this, right? Okay, so that's what I thought. McMaster was first in 1999. In the United States, New Mexico came along in 1979. Harvard likes to think they were first. They weren't even second. So I've had to correct them on that a couple times. But basically, this is the two programs. Also, Hawaii was a program that started problem-based learning. These were pure problem-based learning approaches, and meaning that there was no other class work at all. Now, McMaster has held to that, and they still have that as their program. In the United States, the pure problem-based learning approach never worked. New Mexico started it, Hawaii started it. Very soon, within a few years, they started to have mini classes. And so you had problem-based learning plus a mini curriculum going along with it. And that, I think, is a little bit of the idea with the surface learning, that you're bringing in another component, not just doing the PBL. But in the United States, these schools, I should say New Mexico and Hawaii and Southern Illinois, those three were kind of the ones that did it, and they sort of dropped away from it and added these mini courses pretty quickly. So a report came out, and this report was in 1984. It was released by the American Association of Medical Colleges, and I think actually the title, which is that whole next bullet point, is maybe longer than the results of the report, or whether we paid much attention to it or not. But the report was titled "The Physicians for the 21st Century, the report of the panel on the general professional education of the physician," that's the GPEP part, "and college preparation for medicine." So that was the title of the report. I remember as a faculty member, we all got a copy of this report, and we looked at it and didn't really think it said much. And these were the conclusions and the recommendations. And they recognized the value of improving integration in the teaching of the biological sciences in medical school. You know, that's really profound, right? And they recommended active learning formats that promote self-directed learning and problem solving. Again, not exactly earth-shaking things, but this started people to think and to start to change. So we're in the mid-1980s now. And so what happened was in the late 1980s and into the 1990s, curricular changes really got initiated in the United States. But again, kind of on a small scale. A few schools started to do some things. Generally, they were small changes, but this time frame should be viewed as the beginning of the movement away from the Flexner model. So again, that Flexner model was in place from 1910 till basically into the 1990s. And now, though, things are starting to change. And I would say late 1990s, early 2000, really people started to change curriculums, and a lot of people, especially anatomists, didn't take it too well. And so we're entering the 21st century. And here's the next report. Now, this one is the most recent one, and it's the one that currently has the deans and the education deanlets all upset and all kind of motivated to make changes. And this was another one by the Carnegie Foundation. And they were actually doing a series of comparative investigations of education in the professions. And this started in 2000, and they were looking at educating clergy, lawyers, engineers, nurses, and then the last group they started looking at were physicians. So this was a whole series of reports that the Carnegie Foundation was putting out. And they basically put together a team, and there were 3 authors of this report. It came out in the spring of 2010. And these 3 individuals are all at the University of California, San Francisco. One was a clinician. One was a professional educator, David Irby. He kind of led the team. And this was a younger individual who was working on her PhD at the time. They visited 11 medical schools and 3 non-university teaching hospitals. I kind of think that's comical. In the day of jets and cars, they went to 11 schools, and Flexner, with buggies and railroad, went to 155. But they did do a lot of work on looking at literature. And they conducted interviews, they ran focus groups, they made observations, extensive literature review on medical education and learning. So they did have a background that went with this study. And the study was published, and here's the key findings: that there should be a standardization of learning outcomes. And this was an idea of competency-based assessment. And several schools in the United States and the UK are using competency-based evaluation. The program I'm at, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, is competency-based. So we have 9 competencies. It's like, in the United States, it's like residency education. The residency programs, the residents are evaluated on 6 competencies. At my program, we have 9, because we include research as a competency. But medical knowledge, professionalism, clinical skills, clinical reasoning, things like that, those are competencies. And so their first point is to sort of say, have the learning relate more to competencies versus just giving people grades for courses. And that students may progress at different levels. Now, How we're going to all deal with that in medical school is another question, but that's one thing they're talking about, and that's what they're saying here. Individualization of the learning process, adjust to meet needs, students' learning needs. I'm not sure that one's ever going to come off, but the whole idea of that one is that student A may progress at a different speed than student B, and you should adapt their learning and their curriculum to that type of approach. Now, in all honesty, how you do that when you got 150 students or 300 students is beyond me, that you could individualize the approach. But in some areas, you may be able to do that with regards to maybe clinical training or clinical skills training. But that's what this group was sort of talking about. They also thought there should be an integration of formal knowledge and clinical experience. So this gets back to the same theme that we had earlier, whereas bringing the clinical training down to earlier levels, not heavy clinical training, but at least exposing them to more things. Also, even in the anatomy, exposing them to clinical applications of the anatomy. The idea of contextual learning. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Develop habits of inquiry and innovation. And then finally, focus on professional identity formation. I'm not exactly sure what the last one is after there, but again, they wanted the profession to define itself and the students to feel that they're part of the profession at a very early stage. Now, where are we now? Now, I would say when the Carnegie report came out, as I said, a lot of deans and deanlets and education deans paid a lot of attention to it and tried to push the faculty in those directions. In some cases, they pushed really hard, and in some other schools, they didn't push quite as hard. But we have had a lot of curricular changes in the United States. So where are we now? Well, basically, we're in a period of curricular reform, and many of my colleagues in anatomy either view this as a curse or they view it as an opportunity. And I would like to say it's an opportunity. Sure, it's going to be a little painful at times, but it gives you the opportunity as a faculty member to figure out new ways to teach and new ways to present the material and new ways to bring things into your presentations. And so kind of innovation is sort of the name of things in the United States right now. Now, what are some of the reasons, and I'm going to say unstated, because we have a group called the LCME, the Liaison Committee for Medical Education, and they're the ones that visit the United States medical schools every 5 to 7 years, and they tell you if you're going to be reaccredited. Now, they don't come out and directly say you have to do this, 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 and this. They have a whole book of all these outline things and these rules, and you're supposed to follow them, and you're supposed to develop a program that fits what their things are all about. They don't really say you have to do this, 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 or this, but these are some of the unstated things that they are suggesting that you should consider doing. Because you have to watch it. If you start saying the LCME says we have to do this, then that's bad, because they'll say we never said that. And so you've really got to kind of read between the lines. So one thing is to reduce lecture hours. There's people that feel, like Steve mentioned, that you should just get rid of lectures and you shouldn't have lectures. I am also not in that camp. I think lectures can be very valuable. I think they can be a meaningful experience. What they're suggesting, and I think what a lot of schools are doing, is reducing the number of lectures. And the idea of that is not to have the students sit in the classroom in a lecture hall for like 3 hours at a time with no break, and and then move into the afternoon and do more lectures and things like that. Kind of things that we all used to do 20 years ago, right? And when we had like 25 to 30 hours a week of contact time, okay? Their suggestion is 15 to 20 hours of contact time a week. Now again, they don't really say that, but that's what they're pointing at. Increased time available for self-directed learning. Well, obviously the idea is if you get them out of the classroom, they're going to have time to do other things. Actually, problem-based learning only works if you free up the time in the curriculum. We tried this back in the late 70s, early 80s, and tried to have these kinds of conferences, but we still kept them in lecture and labs all day long. And all of that fails because you can't do a problem-based learning approach or a case-based learning approach or any of these other things if you got them in class the whole time. Because all of these other approaches that Steve talked about or I'm mentioning, the student goes out and learns on their own and then comes back and educates his fellow students. They are part of the educational program. So you got to get them out of the classroom so they can do these things. Next, reduce unnecessary redundancy between courses. Well, you know, this kind of gets back to the idea of a little bit more of an integrated curriculum. I will give you an example. When I was at University of Cincinnati, the histology would teach histology in the fall. Physiology would teach physiology in the spring. Problem was, they had to reteach some of the histology because the students forgot what they learned in the fall, so they had to repeat it in the spring to make sense out of the physiology. That's the kind of redundancy they're suggesting. Now, quality redundancy is good, but you got to look at the redundancy that just beats the same thing over again. So that's sort of what this one's about. Provide less compartmentalized teaching and testing. Well, you know, Steve's already mentioned this. Here's the integration, some type of integration. I'll come back to that. Promote topic integration. Again, same idea with the integration. Now, major restructuring. Okay, so I would say in the United States right now, most all the schools have either had some restructuring or they're going through it and studying it right now. So everything has really changed probably from the way it was 10 years ago, if not even 5 years ago. All right? And the curriculums are kind of dividing out into two groups right now. I'm making a big generalization here, but you'll see where I'm going with this. And basically we have integrated curriculums, and these could in general be integrating everything is what I'm talking about here. You do not have a standard course. You study the cardiovascular system. And in the cardiovascular system you do the histology, the gross anatomy, the physiology, biochemistry, whatever's related to that. You may divide it into 2 years. The first year still may be normal. The second year may be pathophysiology. Or you may have a single pass curriculum. Now, that I mean that you start the curriculum in the fall and you do one system and you go for the next, let's say, 18 months and do a system, but you never come back again. I am not a big fan of that kind of curriculum, okay, because that's where there's no redundancy, and I think that could be a problem. Right now, we haven't had that long enough in enough schools to determine whether it is going to be a problem or not. But I think some amount of redundancy is very good, especially when it relates to anatomy in these kinds of curriculums, and I'll show you more of that in a minute. So that's one of the formats that's being used. The second format I would say is I refer to as a mixed curriculum. In these, the schools are starting out with small courses. Maybe 4-week courses, 5-week courses, a little bit of anatomy, maybe some histology, maybe a little biochemistry. Then they switch into systems. So they do that maybe the first semester, then they go to an integrated curriculum. And that's what I mean by a mixed curriculum. All right? Now, let me show you a couple examples. So this is the curriculum at my institution. Now, for a couple things I have to say. My institution is very unique. And I'm not saying that just because I'm there or anything, or it's at the Cleveland Clinic. It is very unique. They started this program in 2004. We had our first class coming in. We only have 32 students. So most of my colleagues think I've died and gone to heaven. But I only have 32 students, and they are 32 very, very good students. We are part of Case Western Reserve University. They have another program. Their program is 160 students. The two programs are separate in the first 2 years, but in the clinical years, they all go together. Okay? The Cleveland Clinic program is a 5-year program. We are training physician scientists. Our students do 1 year of research and write and defend a master's level thesis. They don't get any master's degree, but that's the whole curriculum, the way it's set up. Here's what our calendar looks like. In the first year, during the summer, they come in 1st of July. They do basic science research, plus they take some cell molecular biology, kind of get everybody on the same page. They do some journal club, but they mostly work every afternoon in a basic science research lab. And they do a small project, but this is just to get them into bench research. Then we get into September, and in September we start the organ system courses. And you can see there's an intro to clinical medicine that continues throughout the whole year. And the students in our program, because we only got 32 students and we got lots of clinical sites, our students go one afternoon every other week, starting in September, so they get about 15 out of 30 weeks in a doctor's office for the whole afternoon. So our students are seeing patients year one, day one, after the summer block. Okay. Second year, organ systems. First year is normal, second year is pathophysiology. So ours is a two-pass system, but we don't have courses. Anatomy is a thread. I am a thread director, part of the course. And threads, as you know, are woven throughout the courses. Interesting analogy, right? We have 17 threads. Everything you can imagine is a thread. Genomics is a thread. Biochemistry, physiology, embryology. I'm in charge of that one too. Histology, neuroanatomy is part of neuroscience. So those are what the threads are. And we just basically fit into this whole thing as you go along. But that's an integrated curriculum. There are several other schools doing this. Case actually does it with their 160 students, but they do a single pass. They start in September, they do all of the systems once around, and they finish March of the next year and go into their third year rotations. All right, so that's that. Now, the other curriculum I mentioned was a mixed curriculum. This is an example at the University of Pennsylvania, and you can see out here they have these basic courses through the first semester. And there's some developmental, molecular biology, some human structure, function, technology, whatever. And then they go into systems for the next year and a half. Okay. So again, this is what I classify as a mixed curriculum. And if you would look around the United States now, there's still a few schools, I can name a couple of them, that have not had curricular reforms like this yet. I guarantee you that the next time the LCME shows up on their doorstep, they will change. Because that's sort of what's happening in the United States. So this is the other kind of curriculum that you will see. Now, some course development and restructuring in the anatomical sciences. So this is where the fun begins, okay? And basically, you know, I love to talk about curricular development and everything, and I love to talk about anatomy and how we're dealing with it. And some guiding principles that I think you have to think about whenever you're changing a course to fit into a curriculum. And I think nowadays you need to think about active versus passive learning. And Steve talked some about this. I'll give you some more examples of this. And if I'm developing a course, these are principles that I'm going to think about. Make use of a variety of educational experiences, a multimodality approach. We've got different types of learners. We've got auditory learners, visual learners, kinesthetic learners. The idea is to try and reach all the learners. So in doing that, you use lots of different approaches. Anatomy is perfect for it. We've got a lab with cadavers, we've got imaging on computers, we've got textbooks, we've got online resources, we've got lectures, you can do small groups. Anatomy is great for this, okay? And we've all been doing it for the last 30 years. Everybody else is just catching up to us, right? Focus on learning in context, a closer integration with clinical medicine. I'll show you in a few minutes, but my course is clinically oriented. We start with a clinical problem. The clinical guy comes and talks about how the anatomy relates to that problem. The anatomist sits there and doesn't do a darn thing. I let the clinical people do all of this. I orchestrate the whole thing. But again, the clinical person talks about anatomy, and so the students are going, he's a doctor, he's at the Cleveland Clinic, he's doing all this stuff. I need to listen to this guy, and I need to learn what he's telling me. Well, what he's telling him is the basic anatomy. I would tell him anyhow. So again, you just sort of kind of transpose things. But we do a lot of focusing learning in context. We're not teaching clinical medicine, but we're at least getting to think about how the anatomy relates to that. Learning should be longitudinal. I think this is hugely important now. Because, as Steve mentioned, as I'm going to mention, all of our courses are dropping in hours. So the trick is to get into the other years. And when I came to the Cleveland Clinic, they didn't say anything about whether I could have time in the second year, third year, fourth year. So I fought my way into each of them. Now, it was a nice, quiet fight. A lot of times anatomists say, well, if I'm going to be in the second year, I've got to have 400 hours or something. You can't do that. Try and just get an hour. Get in the door. I get 1 2-hour section every 4 weeks in the second year. That's all I need. Because I go back over the anatomy they had in the first year. Okay? So again, this I think is hugely important. I also have 2 hours before they start their surgery rotation. I go back through the anatomy that's this time relevant for what they're going to do in their surgical rotation. So get into the other years, because the course hours, you just don't have them anymore, at least in our schools. Now, these are 3 basic points that again, you have to, I think it's important to follow, or you're going to have everything be a problem for everybody. So the first one is you have to have your course match the curriculum or the philosophy of education of the institution. If they're saying they want to do one thing and you try to do something else, all you're going to do is have problems and everybody's going to be unhappy. So you have to try and figure out how you want to do what you do, but in their context. You know, it's kind of a game, in all honesty. And if you're good at the game, you can learn how to work the system. I think I'm pretty good at the game. And I try and teach my young faculty member how to be good at the game. And so that you're kind of adapting to what they want you to do, but you're still doing it the way you want to have it done, or presenting what you want. Second one, you have to develop a course that works best for the group of faculty that you have involved in teaching. If you try and develop something and the rest of your faculty hates it, guess what? It's not going to work, and the students are going to know about it, and somebody's going to end up in the dean's office. So you really got to think about your faculty. Now, for me, it's easy, right? I got one other person. And then I just use clinical people, and I tell them what I want them to do. So it works pretty good. And we have a lot of respect from our clinical people, because we're the first anatomists the Cleveland Clinic has ever had. And I'm sure all of you know about the Cleveland Clinic, right? It is a clinic, huge clinic. We have about 89 operating rooms. We do 4,000 heart valve replacements a year. We see almost 3.5 million patients at our sites in the Cleveland area in 1 year. So this is a factory, and it's mostly filled with MDs. And I came on the scene as the first anatomist they'd ever had. And it was kind of, I was introduced at every meeting as, here's our anatomist. I thought I like crawled out of the Ohio River, because I was from Cincinnati, and I worked my way north to Cleveland. All right? But again, we got a lot of respect right away, so we had them come in and they're doing research projects with us. They can call us up if they want to practice a technique. They come down, they can practice it before they're going to do a surgery. We tried to be their friends so that we could all work together on things, and it has worked out very well. Third and last basic principle, the best fit for the type of students that will participate in your program. I can do things with my students that generally in a lot of medical schools you can't do. We have 1,900 applicants for 32 positions. They all have to have some experience in research. Doesn't have to be master's level. They could just do some senior project in college. But they've had research experience, and these people are very, very smart. If you ranked them in the United States, I've been told that our MCAT scores, which is our pre-med school test, okay, and the GPAs would put us in like the top 5 entering medical school classes in the nation. So I can do things with these people, plus there's only 32 of them, and they're really smart. And so what I do in my curriculum, you can't necessarily do, but you can maybe do parts of things that I do, or steal some ideas and things. But you've got to match your students. Because if you don't match your students, then you're going to have problems again. So again, I think these 3 things you always think about when you're developing a course. All right, so let me give you some innovations and some things people in the United States are doing. And I'll show you a little bit more about our course. Again, it's the Cleveland Clinic Lerner. He gave us $100 million, so he gets his name right there, okay? He used to, you guys would all know the soccer people would know his son, because he owned, he still owns one of the soccer teams in the UK. I can't remember which one it is now, but he, Yeah. So but his dad owned the Cleveland Browns for a while, our American football team. But he gave us some money, and then we're part of Case Western Reserve because we had to be with a degree-granting college. The United States, you cannot have a freestanding medical school like Mayo's medical school. Okay, that's a freestanding medical school. You really can't have those anywhere in the United States anymore because they need to be with an undergraduate or a degree-granting institution, especially in the state of Ohio. So we had to pair with somebody else. So that's sort of where we came from. Now, our curricular approach, as I've already mentioned, it's a problem-based, organ systems-oriented curriculum. Seminars are done in small groups, interactive learning format. So if a course like histology, they may do theirs with 32 students. Renal, they like to do theirs with groups of 8 students. Our PBLs are groups of 8. So again, they have 4 faculty members, sit down with 8 students, and they all go over the same topic that day. So we don't really have lectures per se. I'm not allowed to stand up in front of the group and go through 60 slides. I have to make some kind of an interactive type approach. My associate does the histology with 32 students, and she is very good. She's young, and she knows how to interact with these people, and she is praised as the queen of histology for the way she presents it using virtual microscopy, because we don't have any microscopes, and doing an interactive approach with the students. So it can be done. We have assessment as competency-based, as I mentioned, and now, I didn't tell you the other thing. We have no tests, we have no grades, and it's not pass-fail. It is all competency-based. This took me a little while to get used to. I have no grade input in gross anatomy. I do not have practicals. I do not have anything. So it took me a while to adjust to, okay, how do I know how much they learned? And my goal is to get them ready for their 3rd year or 4th year rotations. That's what I'm supposed to do. Get them ready for surgery, OBGYN, and neurology, whatever else they've got. Make them in a position they can advance and learn more in that rotation. It's not my job to turn them into an orthopedic surgeon or anything else. I just want to make sure they get through the 3rd year and they learn more when they're in the 3rd year. And if I was failing, I figured I'd have all kinds of people lining up at my door, because the people at the Cleveland Clinic, the surgeons, are not bashful. They will definitely tell you whether your students know anything or not. And the word on the street is that our students in my program do know anatomy well enough to live in the operating room. So, must be working. But it's kind of tough not having any grades, tests, or anything else. Now, we give them self-assessment, multiple choice questions, so they can kind of learn where they are. And then they do 2 essay questions a week. We participate in that once in a while, but for anatomy, it's kind of boring. It's open book. They take it home and do it at home. So you know what you get. You get tables out of your own textbook or paragraphs of stuff copied right out of the book. To some extent, they have to rewrite it, obviously, but it's still the same material. So the essays are fine, but it's more seeing if they develop a good answer and that type of thing. So we don't really have grades. So that's kind of interesting. Now, our assessment method, as I said, teaching is primarily interactive learning activities. And this is important right here. The students are responsible for and involved in the learning. We treat them as colleagues from day one. We actually have a dress code at the Cleveland Clinic. Can't wear blue jeans. They can't wear shorts. They've got to basically look nice. They don't have to wear a tie every day, but they have to wear shirt pants for the men. Women have to look nice. If there's a patient in the room, the men have to wear ties. And I really like the dress code. I know that's probably being old-fashioned, but my med students are the best-looking med students I've ever had from day one. And I think that helps get them started in professionalism sooner, because our students are basically colleagues. They're involved in the curriculum. They're involved in teaching one another, and we treat them that way. I think it really helps get them going in the right direction. So I'm not too bad with the dress code, actually. We do these focuses on small groups, learning discussions, a lot of active clinical learning experiences. And as I said, in the first year, they spend 15 afternoons a week, or 15 afternoons in the whole 30-week year. In the second year, they spend 1 afternoon every week. So by the time my students get to be 3rd-year students or in their clinical rotations, they've already seen somewhere upwards of 120 to 150 patients. So they're not a typical 3rd-year student at most other United States medical schools. And again, that's why we do more clinically oriented type of teaching. Topics are integrated, as I mentioned. Length of the program and context is tailored. Formative assessment, including peer review. They have a lot of peer reviewing, a lot of evaluations from PBL facilitators, etc. Now, the anatomy approach, as I mentioned, we use a clinical case to introduce the anatomical information. We use cadavers and imaging once a week is when we have the class to reinforce anatomical concepts. And then we use a longitudinal approach. And basically, it's a 3-step method of learning. And so the week before, they get the clinical case, and they have learning objectives and clinical questions. Then they acquire basic knowledge using a textbook or other online modules that I have for them. And then they come on Monday mornings. I have Monday morning at 8 o'clock in every Monday of the first year. I'm the only one, other than problem-based learning. We have 3 problem-based learning sessions a week, 4 two-hour interactive seminars. The physiology, the histology, the biochemistry, everybody fights for the 4 2 hours, and I get every Monday. Because the surgeons at the Cleveland Clinic said, anatomy is important, and we're going to give you every Monday morning. I have the only promised seminar time in the whole curriculum. So I have every Monday morning from 8 to 10 for 30 weeks. Now, we've given a few of them back at the end of the year because we don't need them. But that's the anatomy time. So they come in, they're on time. They know if they don't show up at my class on time, there's going to be issues. I don't even let them miss once without I call it to their physician advisor's attention. And so they come. And they actually are generally interactive. And so this is what's going on there. And then our cadavers, let me see if I have that on the next slide, and then I'll go back. So the cadavers here, our cadavers is all pro-section because as Steve mentioned about hours, my total hours are 60 hours. That's it to do anatomy. The national average in the United States right now is 140 hours for anatomy. And we just are finishing a new survey up. It's basically stayed the same from 2009 to now. So that's kind of interesting. We're starting to level out at a minimum type of thing. But I only have 60 hours. So we had to use, and again, before I took the job, they said, you've got to use residents to do pro-sections because that's how we want it done, and we're going to give you fresh cadavers. And they said, if you want the job, then here's the rules. I said, okay, we can do this. So basically, we use fresh cadavers, unembalmed, whatever you want to call them, for all of our courses. Oh. I get very animated when I talk about anatomy. I have fun with what I'm doing. So we have residents that do our dissections. This is great because we get residents down into the lab. The students meet the residents. They learn what they're going to be doing at the next level. They get invited up to the operating rooms from day one. And they're working on fresh cadavers. So the residency program directors love it. The residents get to review their anatomy, and they get to teach. And those are competencies as part of residency training in the United States. And so I work with all the disciplines, the orthopedists, ENTs, cardiothoracic, GI, general surgery, urology, OBGYN. I work with all of them. And if they do 16 hours of work with me, we put them up for a faculty appointment. We've appointed 70 of these guys as clinical instructors. It's a true faculty appointment at Case Western Reserve University. Looks great on their fellowship application. But that's the payback. So that they're working with us, they're teaching our students, we give them something back that's a reward to them. But we use all fresh cadavers. That took some challenge also, as you can imagine, going from a regular system with embalmed cadavers and trying to figure out how to work with fresh, unembalmed cadavers. They are all tested, just in case you're wondering, regardless of what they say when they come in and donate the body. We retest them for HIV, hepatitis B, hepatitis C. We don't accept any that have had C. diff or any MRSA. As we're in a hospital environment, we got to keep those infections out of the place. So we're very careful. Everybody's wearing surgical garb when they come into the lab. They're wearing masks, gloves, eyewear, and scrubs. That's the minimum, or a gown over their clothes. So nobody works in the lab without those clothes on. Okay. So that's how we do the anatomy. Now, the longitudinal component, revisit anatomy during the integrated courses in the second year. As I said, I have one session every 4 weeks. I get to do more anatomy with them. I don't add any anatomy. I just reinforce what's out there. We're currently doing a retention study with another medical school that has more of a traditional type approach. And we're giving them assessment at the end of their first year, the end of their second year, the end of the third year. We're in the third year with this study to see whether we do a better job with retention because we're longitudinal. This other school has a 7-week course in the middle of the first year. That's the only time they have anatomy. So we're going to see, we got some results coming out on that this spring that we're going to present at our national meeting, but not a publication yet. We're waiting for, excuse me, a couple third year, fourth year type of things. Now, some other things that people are doing. Team-based learning. I'm sure you've heard about this. This is kind of like kind of modified PBL in a lecture classroom. And this is seeming to work pretty well. This individual has developed a lot of it at New Jersey Medical School. We've published a couple of his papers in 08 and 09 in anatomical science education. It's a way to turn your lecture hall into a small group session. And a lot of medical schools in the United States in anatomy are kind of adapting this because it seems to kind of give you that interactive learning, not a pure lecture type thing. So it's finding a lot of favor. So what they do is it's a large classroom activity. Students work through and assign learning objectives before class. Classes begin with an individual assessment quiz. Then they divide up into teams who discuss the learning objectives. The faculty address student knowledge issues. So if there's some knowledge issues, they'll tell the person up in front will then maybe give a brief description of where some, identifying some problems. And then the teams retake the assessment quiz. Some schools are using these assessment quizzes that go right into the students' grades. Sometimes they don't. But again, this seems to be something that a lot of people are pleased with. It's an effective learning way to incorporate small group peer teaching into a course. Problem-based or case-based format with fewer facilitators. That's the thing. If any of your deans come talk to you about doing problem-based learning, be prepared to tell them how many people you need to do this. Most schools and most deans don't pay attention to this. Case Western Reserve University, they're doing it with 160 students. They are having a terrible time finding facilitators because you got to switch them every 8 weeks or 10 weeks and they burn out. And that's a huge problem that most administrators don't think about when they're planning all these great interactive types of activities. And it takes a lot of faculty development. Students want to be a responsible team member and they're motivated. This works really good. Okay, it works good in PBL because if the students don't do their job to help their other classmates, then the other classmates get mad at them. So you got some nice group motivation there for doing your job, and actually it only has to happen about once, and then everybody's motivated. Students are directly involved in the learning, theirs and their peers. And again, we really stress this. You might say, well, how do you get your students to read ahead of time? My students at Cincinnati never read ahead of time because it's an expectation. We expect them to be involved in the learning process. We expect them to read before they come to class. So it's not really a question. We just anticipate that's what they're going to do because they're part of the learning process. Another situation, these are some unannounced table conferences. This is by Dr. Jeffrey Lateman. Some of you may know Dr. Lateman. He's president, outgoing president, after the meeting in April of the American Association of Anatomists. He's at Mount Sinai in New York. He's gotten rid of practicals in the lab, and he does oral practicals. This is kind of interesting. They announce the tables involved at the beginning of the laboratory. So he'll walk into a lab and say, okay, tables 5, 8, and 10, you're going to have an oral today. And of course, there's immediate panic, consternation, and everything else. 30 minutes of questioning for the students in the dissection group. Everyone gets the same grade. Isn't that interesting? So this is what helps teamwork. You get 4 of these a year, and you can drop 1. Now, he didn't used to have this drop 1, but he kind of had so much student going completely nuts that he had to put something in so they could drop 1 when they didn't do so well that day or something like that. So that's why he added that. And again, this is to promote teamwork. And the idea, since medicine now is much more practiced as a team, at least in the United States, than it used to be, and it's going to be more that way in the future, this is that you help the lowest member of your team come up to the rest of the team. And you all get the same grade. And he's had great success with it. I mean, actually, after the first one, everybody's freaking out. But then they get used to it. They know there's not a lot of advance notice, and it seems to work pretty well. So he's pretty sold on the idea. And he has a big class, okay? He has a class of, I think it's 150 or 60 at Mount Sinai. So you can do this in big classes. And they still do all dissections. David Bernanke, let me show you what we found. David Bernanke, he's not the financial guy from the United States. It's actually, that's his uncle, though. He's at the Medical University of South Carolina. And this was, again, an activity in the dissection lab, and they had a curricular change. So this is a modification due to a curricular change. And they changed to an integrated schedule. Well, they had to reorganize the lab schedule to mess with other activities in the afternoons, because now in the curriculum they brought in simulation center, radiology, physical diagnosis, and laboratory activities in other disciplines. So he had to figure out, okay, how do I get my labs done? So he split the dissection into groups, the teams of 6, and 3 would dissect on Tuesday, 3 would dissect on Thursday, and then everyone came to the lab on Monday, and on Monday they showed each other what they had dissected. So here's your peer versus peer teaching. And again, this is another positive thing that the curricular people like to see. And this has worked very good in his situation. So again, all of these things are designed for the type of course or the problems they've run into. This next one by Drs. Von Lee and Bratislav Vidic, he's at Texas Tech. The problem they had was a shortage of faculty. Where have we heard of that before? So a shortage of faculty. So what they did was turn this into an opportunity for peer teaching. And this promotes professionalism, teamwork. And what they did was they had 5 students in a group. They got 2 students to become a teaching team. And they would have a pre-lab afternoon that they would work with this pair. And then the activity, when they went to lab the next day, then these 2 students had a preview of what they were supposed to do so they could help the team. And that way, if the instructors couldn't get around to all the tables, you had somebody at the table that could help out. So again, this met a need he had, which wasn't not enough faculty. Let me show you one in histology, and then we'll skip the next one. This is an interesting one. This is from an individual at University of Arizona. We published a paper about this program in 2011. And she had a problem. And you probably have had this problem if you teach histology also. There was a lack of interest in learning basic tissue types because they didn't see any relevance. And so they had a curriculum reform. They have a mixed curriculum. And they begin with foundations, then they continue with systems. So what she did was the first day of class, and the first week this is, they did histology lab in teams, and they were given unknown organs in the morning and known organs in the afternoons. So instead of starting with the basic tissues, they started with a bunch of unknown organs. And then they had some known organs. Then on days 2 and 3, they had some lectures on tissue types, relevance, architecture, organ architecture lecture. Then on day 5, they went back and looked at the tissue types and the organs and put the 2 things together. And so again, promotes teamwork, provides relevance. So this was, again, a way she attacked this problem with an innovation. So I'm going to skip the next one. So what's next for medical education in the United States? And again, this is sort of my feeling about what's next, okay? So it may or may not happen, but whatever. Number of medical schools is increasing. As I mentioned earlier, there's about 18 new medical schools online in the United States, plus most medical schools are increasing their class size. So we don't have the problem that the UK is having. Actually, we're bringing more people into medicine. Problem is going to be there's no additional residency program slots at this time. So this is where the problem's going to come in unless the government decides to, and of course we're having economic issues too, and if they don't have money to start residency positions, then we're going to have a jam up at that end. But we need more physicians in the United States, especially in family medicine. And there's several specific programs that are going to 3 years now for family medicine training. And so we're having more med schools. Curriculum reform is alive and well. A variety of approaches are being used. And I would say I could not say like 10 schools are using the same approach. Almost every school has a different approach than any other school. Now, they may still be this big format, one integrated, one, a single pass, double passes, mixed curriculums. Some old curriculums are still out there, but nobody's doing the same thing. There's no magic bullet that anybody's identified. Every program that I know of is still using cadavers. You may have heard, because deans like to say this, that there's schools in the United States not using cadavers. I have not found a single program in the United States that isn't using cadavers in some way, shape, or form. Now, pro-section approaches are only used at 2 places exclusively, my program and at Michigan State University. I haven't heard of anybody else that uses a total pro-section approach. I think what's happening in the United States and what's going to happen is a mixed approach. I think you're going to have pro sections because it cuts down on hours for certain areas where the reward isn't worth the time, like pelvis. And then for other areas, they're going to still have student dissection because it is worth the time, like thorax, abdomen, pelvis, neck, or not pelvis, but neck. Extremities might do team teaching or peer teaching. So I think those are the approaches that are kind of probably going to happen in the United States to bring the hours down. But everybody still uses cadavers. There's one branch campus of one osteopathic school of a few students that I've heard might not be using cadavers. But every new school is all using cadavers. So if you hear anybody saying that the United States, nobody's using cadavers or they're trying to change, that's not the case at all. Student dissection is still important. As far as I'm concerned, cadavers are the way to learn. There isn't any good evidence to show that prosection or student dissection is any better than one or the other. The data actually shows the amount of learning is about the same. So, you know, you can take it for that. Now, we do give our students a chance to dissect also. So I think if you're going to have a prosection, you should give the students an opportunity to dissect sometime in their career if they want to. My students actually teach a physician's assistant anatomy course that we do for a local college. It's a master's degree program. We do that in the spring and summer, beginning mid-May, go to 1st of August. 2/3 of my first-year students come back, do the dissections, and teach. So now they're dissecting and teaching, reviewing their anatomy. I've got longitudinal instruction. So again, you kind of fit everything to what you're doing. And the last thing I would just say is that you should be innovative. If somebody's talking about curricular reform at your institution, figure out a way to work with the system. Still try and do things that you want to do, but think of new things to do. As I said, there's lots of examples that I showed you a few here. We're publishing other ones in our Anatomical Sciences Education Journal. But clearly, in this day and age, be innovative with whatever your approach is. And thank you very much. You've been an excellent audience. I've enjoyed having an opportunity to talk with you.